Okay, is the mic on? Great. Thanks everybody for coming to this panel. This is the first time I'm meeting some of the panelists, and the occasion is our new report, which is called Fighting for Survival. And I'm Anya Schiffrin. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I have been writing about what I call global muckrakers and media startups, especially in the Global South, for several years now. I'll introduce the panel very quickly, and then I will tell you a little bit about our report, and we'll start the conversation. So next to me is Lina Attalah, who's worked for a number of Egyptian startups. Where are you right now, Lina?
Mada Masr.
Still at Mada Masr, great. And then we have Lina Ejeilat from 7Iber. Am I pronouncing it right? Nick Mathiason, who's the founder of Finance Uncovered. Alicja Peszkowska, great, from Outriders Network in Poland. And Misha Ketchell from The Conversation Australia. And the last time I saw you was in Melbourne in November when I interviewed you. So in 2015, we wrote a report called Publishing for Peanuts, where we profiled something like 30 media startups in the Global South to find out how they functioned, how they got money, what they were covering, what they were doing. And in 2018, we went back to see who had survived. There's so much hype about different business models, and we wanted to know what actually was the truth. If you're a small outlet doing great investigative journalism or accountability reporting, what is your reality? So some of the report's online, so anyone who wants can read it, and I'll leave this copy here if anyone wants to take it. But some of the highlights were that economic survival is really the most difficult thing for the outlets in the Global South. And that's followed by political problems. It turns out that in many parts of the world, this will come as no surprise with the rise of demagogues, it's gotten really difficult to be a sort of accountability reporter or an investigative reporter. And what we also discovered was that there were many cases where these journalists were breaking news and doing very important work, but they still weren't making any money. So Daily Maverick in South Africa, they exposed a lot of the Gupta leaks corruption from Zuma and the ruling family, but they're still not making money. People come up to them on the street, they hug them, they love them, they won awards, still no funding. We spoke to Investigate West in Seattle, that was one of the northern ones, and they said they used to do events, they've stopped doing events because it's just too much work to put them together. So the big outlets, you know, the New York Times, the Financial Times, they can have conferences, they can do all kinds of things to make money that often the small people can't do. And the small people are trying to do investigative reporting and accountability reporting in dangerous situations, and they often just don't have the bandwidth. They're trying to survive. So originally the report was going to be called Learning from Success, and I actually changed the title to Fighting for Survival, because 3 years later, so many of them are still getting money from the big foundations and the big philanthropists. We also did a section on outlets that have failed and why. And we did some in-depth pieces looking at Mexico, for example, and the blogger community in Kenya. And one of the things that we also found was the closer we got to the outlets, the more we saw how complex their situation is. So from afar, people would say, oh, they're a huge success, they're a role model. But when we actually got to them, it turned out they were often struggling. So it wasn't a cheerful, it wasn't necessarily a cheerful report, but I think one of my takeaways, and J.J. Robinson's here, who wrote the Publishing for Peanuts report with me, was I came away really impressed and full of admiration that in countries where the circumstances for journalists are really difficult, people are struggling and they won't stop. And we did a huge survey, more than an hour, 70 questions, and we asked everyone, do you have an exit strategy? Everyone said no. I'm going to keep doing this. They're making sacrifices. People borrowed money from friends and family to get started. They've never paid it back. Many of them don't even get a salary, but they're just completely committed to committing journalism. So my first question for the panelists is, you're all still here. How have you survived? What have you managed to do to make a go of it in this tough world? And anyone can go first who wants.
Sure. Okay, so our media started in 2013, and it started in a very difficult political moment in Egypt. It was a moment of a transformation featuring basically a military coup, and what would come afterwards is a set of unprecedented restrictions on public space, on media, on political and civil liberties, and of course in parallel to all of this, because the economy is connected to the political situation, so also a decline in the economic situation. And when we started, because we started as a group of 24 co-founders who were expelled from another organizations because of our political views, we decided that when we would start a new media, we have to try and invest as much as possible thinking about the business model, so that to make it really hard for anyone to just put us at the door between dusk and dawn, basically. What we started off doing was basically try out everything that people tend to try out. So everything from advertisement, from doing services, from organizing events, from selling merchandise. And again, 24 people sounds like a big group of people, but those of us with the expertise weren't many, so it was taking on too much. The lesson we learned throughout these 6 years, as we near 6 years of existence, and as we generate, what you may consider a faint amount of 20% of our operational budget, is that it is a trying and learning and failing process. And I'm a strong believer in this idea of failing and failing hard and learning from our failures, or failure being the most formative experiences. But as we stand, what has been working for us and where we feel that we want to invest more and more, and that's particularly in the last 2 years, is in fact two things. Services, particularly editorial services that capitalize on our skill set, basically, and membership. Now, the one thing I'll say about membership, and I agree with Anya about the hype, and I agree that there is too much belief in this model being a one-size-fits-all type of model. We opted for membership not because only it can be a lucrative source of revenue, but because it's also a form. It's a form of political funding, in the sense that I live in a country like other countries in the world where foreign funding can land you prison jails, prison terms, and even death sentences in some cases. And we want to be able to stand out to our governments and tell them, well, our media is being funded by none other than our readers, basically. At the same time, we're very clear, not that we can reach that goal, but we're also very clear that even if membership can cover 100% of our operational budget, it's not something that we want, because at the end of the day, all those members are the kind of able members who can change the editorial direction of our newspaper if we decide to be 100% funded by our members. So we know that it needs to be an up-and-coming sort of revenue, and it's a revenue line that we've learned to believe in just because we've seen how it helped us in the last couple of years. We're determined to develop it, but at the same time, we're quite conscious of its limitations, especially in terms of the political line of what we're doing. So at this point, we're working towards a more modest goal, which is we know that we're not going to be able to survive without donor money, but if within 3-4 years we can reach a formula where we generate 50% of our money through revenue that is basically coming our way through our readers, not only we would feel a certain level of success, but we would also feel that this is politically making sense, in the sense that much of the funding of this place is coming from its community. So yeah, I think that's the main thing I wanted to say.
One question, which is, in closing societies, do people want to be identified with you? Is this a problem? Or anybody else? Do you want to talk?
Actually, just to build off of what Lina said, because the online magazine that I run is based in Jordan, and we've also, we've been around for a number of years, and we've also tried so many different things. We rely primarily on grant funding. We do have 20% of our revenue coming from trainings and consultings and editorial services and a range of things. But one of the many things we've tried, we did try. We did try to attract some kind of niche advertising where, we're not a daily news website, we're more of an online magazine. We do more in-depth reporting and slower journalism. So we knew that we cannot attract the kind of, advertising that goes after large volumes of traffic that come from daily news, but we knew that we do have an audience that can be attractive to certain advertisers, and a number of people have told us this very, very honestly. They said, we like your content, but we cannot afford as a commercial brand to be affiliated with you. Because of the controversial nature of some of the political content. We've even had one company that did want to have some banners on the website. They actually said just not on any political content, not on any socially controversial content. So just like on the safest pieces, which in the end just ended up not being feasible for anybody and didn't work. So that was one of those things that. We tried for about a year, and then we realized that we were just investing so much energy into something that was not gonna pay off. Just to also build off of what Lina said, I think yes, it's important to try so many different sources of revenue, and as long as you can have diverse streams of revenue where you're not dependent on one organization, one funder, then that's also a form of sustainability. Sustainability, people defining sustainability as just necessarily, weaning off of any sort of grant funding model, I don't think is very realistic. And I don't know why this is also always repeatedly asked of independent journalism, where it's not asked of other sectors that do very important things for society, I think you look at certain things like, in academia, in documentary film, in certain aspects of just work that is, considered a public service, that there is continuous long-term, sort of philanthropic support or support that is, not defined by a commercial logic. But then with journalism, and at least with this kind of journalism that we do, you find that you start off with grant funding, and you start off with this sort of donor support, but then once you start to actually produce good journalism and good content, and to start making an impact, then people start to say, oh, where's your business model, and it's an important question. But I also think that there's just something that, like you said, and I think like the report, the conclusion that it comes to, I don't think how reasonable it is to expect that you can 100% support yourself through like a various range of commercial activity.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the points of the report, sort of a wake-up call, like let's not have fantasies about this kind of work. I don't know if either of you, Nick, Alicia, did you want to come in?
I can say so we've been around since 2017, so we can maybe as well die soon, which I don't hope for, certainly. But we are still pretty young, and I was happy to learn that we are presented as a success story, and if success is surviving, then great. And I'm kind of both proud of us, but also continuously scared, because it's not easy. And our approach is that one thing is to produce news and content, and another one is to find a space in this modern, world. Maybe that's a little too much, but with the new media and new political situations and new social needs, to kind of build structures to support stories. And so we have an organization that supports that, and this is our diverse revenue. These are our diverse revenue streams, because we do have a network where we do knowledge sharing between people who struggle with similar things that we do, trying to be both like entrepreneurs and storytellers and I don't know, performers and all of these other things that are now expected from you if you're supposed to survive. So yeah, I would also say that what's your business model? Yeah, the business model is to try to have some economic activity coming from consulting and trainings. And of course, yes, having grants, because this is a lot has been said during this festival about journalism being a public service, and it is, and I don't think it's going to generate profit, like it's some kind of a trap. So, there are certain things we can earn money from, but I don't think we're going to be profitable ever. And then in order to survive, we also have to build our identity as an organization, and it's both by being open to opportunities and then also try to stay focused. And the longer we are around, the easier it is for us to say no to certain things, but we also have to be kind of open to whatever comes from. We have, for example, like we've been recently asked to provide consultancy for some NGOs in like countries eastern from Poland, and that was great, and it kind of recognized that we have some skills that we can provide, and it was also a surprise for us, but now we're going to make it a project, right? Because it's also going to help us survive and produce better content. But I think our biggest struggle has been to attract money for content, because it's not very scalable. It's difficult, basically.
Nick, could you tell us a little bit about your organization as well as how you survive?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our organisations are called Finance Uncovered. So we train journalists and activists around the world to investigate tax abuse, money laundering and corruption, and then we help participants to get stories out there, and also media organisations. We were incubated by Tax Justice Network, an NGO, which were pivotal in trying to in mainstreaming the tax abuse and tax haven concepts, which are now global policy issues, and so they deserve a lot of. Anyway, I was a journalist for 20 years or so, half of which was in a financial. I was at the Guardian Observer as a financial journalist. So I was asked to program a course to investigate all this stuff, and we had on our first course Will Fitzgibbon, ICIJ, and also Khadija Sharif was on our first course as well. So we basically transitioned to being an independent organisation, and that process took basically 3 years. It's important for us to be independent, as we are a journalistic organisation, didn't want to be part of an advocacy organisation, although there's nothing wrong with that. Greenpeace, for instance, are doing amazingly brilliant work in that area. So I think we are predominantly donor funded, although initially we made most of our money as we built up to becoming independent from doing trainings for advocacy organisations, ActionAid, Transparency International, Public Service International, the union, global union. They gave us a leg up in order to get the cash together to transition to full-timeness. Now we are virtually 95% donor funded, but we would like to shift that down to 75% over the next 2.5, 3 years. And how to do that is a challenge. We'll be still doing the training. An element of membership. I mean, we're in London, so I think we've got a good opportunity to engage with Londoners. I mean, we've trained 320 journalists from over 90 countries. So we get a very good kind of perspective as to the kind of media organisations. And thinking about some of the people we work with, I think of, for instance, a bloke called Emmanuel Dogbevy who runs Ghana Business News. Do you know him? Yeah, I mean, he's an amazingly brilliant journalist, really energetic, and he kind of basically survives by doing media consultancy and putting that money into his website, which does really good work. They do tax avoidance stories where most Ghana papers would not touch that. And then I hear what you say about the Maverick, but I think Amazon Ghana, after the Gupta leaks, more than doubled their membership, so that it was 18% of their overall revenue base, still obviously donor funded. I think was it KCIJ newspaper in Korea? I mean, they brought down a president, and they saw their subscriber level go up enormously. I mean, that they're in an emerging economy rather than a fragile state. So there's a difference. But,
And one of the interesting things we found in the report is that political transition can make or break you, and it can work both ways. So in some cases, there's huge demand. When the government changes or society opens up, there's suddenly, or gets worse, like in the United States, where the New York Times is doing much better in subscriptions since Trump came in. So sometimes political transition can really help, but sometimes it can also kill outlets or make the competitive environment more difficult. So Malaysia Kini for years was one of the few alternative places, but then with the democratic transition, there's now so many more outlets doing investigative reporting that their life has actually gotten a little bit more precarious. I think that another thing we really explored in the report was spin-offs, and to what extent, I think, Nick, what you're talking about is really fascinating, and to what extent can universities incubate these outlets? To what extent, like the Mail, Amma Bugani, I think, came from the Mail and Guardian, can established media outlets incubate? And I think that the conversation is actually a really interesting example, because by not being dependent on newspapers, you've opened up a whole other new sort of source. I mean, for syndication. So anyway, Misha can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I guess the first thing I'd say is that pretty much like everybody else on this panel, I find that the experience of trying to fund a journalism operation is one of living in a world that's very precarious. So you constantly feel like you're on the edge of not succeeding, and you're constantly sort of running around looking for money. So the conversation was founded in Australia in 2011, and the idea behind it really is working with academics to inform the public. So it's a very journalistic mission, really about making access to knowledge more democratic, giving people access to knowledge when they need it, at the time they need it, to inform their thinking about what's going on in the public sphere, to inform democracy. So it's a very sort of clear, pure journalistic mission. But then the difficulty is chasing money to fund it, and having all the problems that the other panellists have talked about. So basically the way that we fund our work is we get money from the university sector. Universities sort of pay us for the work that we do with them, which basically provides a sort of public engagement for the academics who write for us. We also get some money from philanthropy. We chase donations as well, much like The Guardian, and that feels very fragile, that money. I see The Guardian asking every single day, we're asking every single day, and I'm presuming at some point some people are going to get sick of being asked. We also have to spend a lot of time, being very nice to and building relationships with people with money, and that's a big part of the work. So it's sort of a never-ending and quite precarious attempt to bring everything together. And I think the one thing I would say about it is that it can be very diverting from your mission, what you're trying to do. So there's a lot of pressure on everybody to find new ways of making money. And you find yourself doing things that aren't necessarily your core skill set if you're a journalist, and they sort of can steal your time, and they can in some ways sort of weaken your capacity to do what you set out to do. So we do things like media training courses for academics, which raise a little bit of money, or a jobs board, or those sorts of things. But you've got to make some pretty tricky choices, I think, in those areas.
Yeah. So many of you are working in sort of complicated political situations. We've got Brexit, the closing signing Poland, obviously the Middle East. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about any of the great reporting that you've done and the politics of the situation where you are. It would be interesting to hear about that.
So maybe I could, because I'm going to be brief, because so this is also difficult, and I actually didn't mention anything about the membership model. But because we are doing it, but we are doing it slowly. I have also done it before when I had my own band. We crowdfunded an album, and I know how much energy goes into crowdfunding, and we have been crowdfunding, but it's just a lot of work to actually manage expectations and then to just lead the campaign like this. And I think it would be a lot easier for us if we picked a side. Poland is very polarized now. There were some events, including the killing of the mayor, who was actually also a friend with Jakub, our founder. If we picked a side then, I think maybe we could have gotten very many members very quickly. But we want to try to be not partisan, and we are trying to build a medium that's more about like global issues that have an impact on like a local scale as well. So we are trying really to bridge the divide. There are some new media organizations in Poland now that are doing something else. They're doing like more investigative journalism, and they are supported by the members' money. But we are just trying to do something different, which is both. I hope it's going to be our strength in the long run, but it's tricky.
Yeah, that's one of the points that J.J. Robinson made in publishing for Peanuts, is that in very polarized societies, actually being nonpartisan can sometimes turn out to be a niche that actually helps with the business model too. I don't know, Nick, did you want to talk about Brexit and life as reporting in Brexit? Does that?
Well, luckily we don't have anything to do with reporting on Brexit because
Aaron Banks, no exposés of.
Well, there's enough people doing that, so we don't need to. But that's not our priority. We want to basically what we want to do is increase the quantity and quality of illicit finance-related news items, particularly in the developing and emerging world. So to that end, in the last year or two, I mean, three of the examples very quickly. One story we worked on, we went to Dhaka, Bangladesh, worked with Daily Pratham Alo, which I think is probably the bravest paper out there at the moment, in a difficult environment. And what we were doing, basically the journalists there are doing some brilliant work and landed on a fantastic corruption story focusing on the state-run gas distribution company. Massive corruption in there, which was raising the prices for people who weren't paying bribes, industrial customers. They weren't paying. If you didn't pay a bribe, your tariff would go up, and you wouldn't get continuity of service. And the journalist there wrote. He had leaks of information, mobile phone sound files, and he wrote a fantastic story. Trouble was, it was a little bit dense. It wasn't, and typical in corruption stories, it's a very difficult thing to kind of put on paper and hold readers and make them understand it. So what we did was we just provided an editing service and also tried to write in lawyer, media, legal kind of phrasings into the story. So that's and through that has become a big story in Bangladesh, and I'm really happy about that. For the other one, quickly, was Burkina Faso. We did a tax story based on a gold company owned by one of Russia's richest guys. He got a low tax guarantee on a royalty rate in a particular gold mine there, and that was an interesting story because we worked with Sonozo, which is a federated. It's a federation of investigative centres in West Africa, and the coordinator there was brilliant. And then started, so through her and this Burkina Faso journalist who, I didn't speak French, he didn't speak English, but basically we were writing drafts, and our coordinator was translating, and through that you could get a story out there, which was.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And you're right about corruption stories. They're so important, but often for outsiders, there's so much inside baseball and so much detail, it can be really hard to make them compelling. I guess that's part of why ICIJ always stresses the human cost, right? How much money is gone. Did either of you want to come in, either of the Linas or both?
So I just want to go back to what Alicia said, because we didn't also have it easy when back in 2013 we decided not to, take any sides and be that, third player or, and there was a conscious decision not to start doing membership back then because of the polarization. And back then we thought that we should wait for a better moment until the dust settles. And I think our membership program right now is centered on the fact that the dust has settled to no information. Casualty has been information. People need information very badly, and that's what's mobilizing them to become members in our organizations. Even some of them, I'm surprised in seeing the list of sales early this year, for example, they have started including people who were actually insulting us 5 years ago because we were, for example, reporting about violence. And I think the kind of reporting, especially the investigative type, is what's mobilizing people to put their money in this project. Our reporting recently has also been centered on identifying the change in the ruling structure of the country, so how basically the intelligence services are much more proactively influencing how parliament is elected, influencing what judges get appointed, creating parallel structures to the bureaucracy. And I think that there is a level of insight that is encouraging people to, forget about polarization and just, seek out for the information. So I just, yeah.
Just a small comment that, I think I agree definitely that in certain contexts, being non-partisan and doing credible journalism and just doing good quality journalism becomes a niche in itself. But at the same time also, I think that in our contexts, in authoritarian regimes where there are repressive media laws and repressive, basically laws related to just democratic rights in general, just attempting to do this kind of credible, honest journalism is in itself an act of activism and is in itself taking sides, And I think this is something that, we do not shy away from. But what is interesting, and I think what maybe the others have mentioned as well, is that you start to look at your loyal readers and the people who follow your content constantly. There are people who are in policy making, in maybe somehow, close to certain positions of power, where we know that they follow and they read, but they wouldn't necessarily publicly, endorse the content, or maybe actually they also really dislike what you stand for, but they still read everything that you publish. And then there are the people who really they feel that this is important, and and that it covers, it gives them something that they really need, and it gives a voice to stories that would otherwise find no space in the media. But then those are not necessarily the people who can pay, who do have that even the minimum level of purchasing power to be able to support it. We're still doing our research and our groundwork on our readership and trying to identify, okay, so who are the where is that cross section of readership that is going to be willing to put in some money to support this kind of work. But we also realize that there's a bigger group that really value this content but wouldn't necessarily be able to support it, at least not to a scale that is.
And I have one last question, which you can all answer or not as you want before the audience, which is, what is the role of the big platforms? Are Google and Facebook helping you get advertising revenue? Are they bringing the readers? Are they actually a disaster? How do you engage with them?
Perhaps I can jump in on that one. I was actually in Australia at the moment. There is a inquiry by the competition regulator into Google and Facebook, and I was in a room with a whole bunch of media outlets and Google and Facebook just a couple of weeks ago, and basically the people representing Google and Facebook were saying, it's a healthy competitive market. We don't have market power. You can choose who to play with. And every single media company in the room said, we cannot survive without working with Google and Facebook. For us, 60% of our traffic really comes from those two. And for most media outlets in the country, it was of that scale or even more so. So the point that was being made was, this is not a partner that we can choose to partner with. This is a mandatory partner. And that implies a lot about the power relationship. And it implies a lot about your negotiating position. Interestingly, in that room, there's also a bunch of News Limited people who are heavily lawyered up. And News Limited is very unhappy with Google and Facebook at the moment as well, and is trying to exercise some power as well to basically try to get a fairer deal because of the extent to which they've taken the revenue that used to support journalism.
Yeah, historically in New York City, the news kiosks were all controlled by the mafia. And now you're suddenly making me think that lock-on distribution, in a way, is comparable, right?
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment? Yeah.
I'm going to be very quick. I would say it depends. So So when we have this this work funded by grants, we talk to Google and Facebook, and we use this money if they want to give it to us. And so like this is like them funding our work. Then when it comes to distributing the news, is it a help? Like we kind of experiment. Like some of the things have turned out to be a hit. Like we've been converting some of our interactive stories into the Insta Stories format, and people liked that, but they also just liked that we experimented with it. But are they responsible for us reaching a lot more people? No. But could we do it without them? No. So I would say it's very tricky. It depends on the tool. It depends on a given project. If it's, yes, advertising our content or asking for support from our members, or if it's sponsoring our other activities. Well, it varies.
I haven't really got a take on what how to engage necessarily with those two organisations, but I just I looked at the Google and Facebook's 10K filing today, which is their annual report, and just so we're all aware, just so we remind ourselves rather, Google has a revenue of $136 billion last year, of which 116 came in advertising, and cash and cash equivalents. Their cash pile is 109 billion. That's their cash. They've got 109 billion just sitting there, up 60% on the previous year. So we're talking huge money. And just Facebook advertising revenue, $55 billion, $55 billion in last year, and their cash pile is 41 billion.
And what's their tax rate?
Well, we know that in most of their profitable markets around the world, their tax rates are very, very low, and we'll be probably be seeing stories about that quite soon, I understand.
Yeah, I think so.
Further ones,
I think
indeed.
That's right. Yeah. So throwing some crumbs at journalists. Thank you for that, Nick. It's always good to be reminded.
Now, I'm just going to make a quick comment about Facebook, where I think not depending on advertising meant that, you know, it was easier for us to decide to, you know, go where the readers are and, you know, publish, publish, for example, journalistic content that is like just specifically for Facebook. But it's one of those things where, you know, you feel like this is a beast that you have to keep on feeding that will never have enough, and it's so it's very important, you know, for us to be careful. Where yes, we do produce videos that are just for Facebook. We do pay attention to our Facebook reach. We've been doing well. We have very high engagement, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to get too carried away there, because any minute, you know, algorithms change, things suddenly change, then you just, you know, have to change strategy so abruptly, and we don't want to do that, and we don't want to. There was a lot of talk in recent years about like the death of the homepage and the death of the websites, and I think, you know, the internet is very ephemeral, but, you know, then it just becomes even more so when content is just so scattered all over the place and so difficult to search for, to archive, to find in a proper way. And I think this is, when I look at a lot of the stuff that we have covered in recent years, I think just the importance of paying attention to archiving, to searchability, to how much control you have over the content. You know, when is Facebook suddenly going to decide that, you know, they're going to, I don't know, who knows, you know, take down some videos, change something, cancel a service, introduce something new. So obviously you just feel like you have very, very little control, and this is something that we are conscious of. You know, you cannot ignore Facebook, but you don't want to be too dependent on Facebook.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Did you have anything else, Lina, or good? So maybe we'll take a couple questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes. Would anybody like to ask anything? Yeah, please. I don't know if there's a mic, or I see Sue Valentine's just walked in. If you have a question, you're welcome.
Yes, my name is Lars Bestle from International Media Support. First of all, thank you for a great report. It's really an important contribution to the current discourse and organizations like us working to support the media startup community. Great panel also. You mentioned, Anya, about the wake-up call to donors and to the media support community. Can you explain a little bit more about this? And also, I would like to ask the panel, what do you think of this argument, which I think is that donors need to step up. They need to realize that the media startup community cannot survive by membership models or other ways of diversifying. So, but isn't there also some cons about these donor funds and the dependency and so it would be great to get a bit more into this.
Sure. Well, I actually did a report in 2017 about the effects of donors on newsroom independence, and I'm almost finished with my third volume on media capture. So it's something I've thought about a lot. I think I just turned 56, and I think one of the things as you get older is you have more of a panoramic view. So I saw that people that we were, I've been on the Soros Foundation board, 9 years on the journalism board. So I saw that people we started funding, years later weren't making it. I began to have a bit more of the institutional memory. So I didn't want to come to the place where I am now, but I'm at that place, which is, it's just not realistic to expect many of these small outlets in low-income countries to make it on their own financially. If you want great investigative reporting in Malawi or in Cameroon, the donors have a key role to play. On the downsides, I have written about, one thing I've seen a lot, like in Africa, for example, is the influence of people like Gates Foundation, right? The donor money has changed, so it's no longer core support. It's geared often to themes. Open Society Foundation, sorry to plug them, does give a lot of core support, but many other donors fund people to cover tax justice, to cover health, or to cover certain subjects. I was really critical of that a few years ago. Now I feel like, hey, at least they're giving money. One of the exciting meetings we've been having here in Perugia is there's talk afoot now of can we raise a global fund to support media or support for investigative journalism. So Drew Sullivan on OCCRP has convened people to talk about this. James Dean from BBC Media Action. So there are some big ideas out there right now, including taxing Facebook to pay for journalism. So I think that desperate times produce great ideas and creativity. So those are some of the ideas out there. But I'm certainly happy to talk more, refer people to my other studies. But many of you get donor money, so maybe Misha already alluded to some of the problems. But do you want to go in on that to talk about that at all? Pros, cons of donors?
I would just say that it would be great if there was more potential to actually fund stories and not other activities that are more, like NGO-like, not support activities, but like content. And another thing, it would be great if there was some incentive for partnerships between big media outlets that are established and small news organizations, because a lot of this money goes to the established organizations for a reason, because they're gonna deliver, but we have no way to grow if we do not get this exposure and if we don't get to produce stories that will matter, right? Like, how can we attract attention and audiences if we don't deliver great content? But it's very difficult to fund that.
And I also think, by the way, I teach, so obviously I'm biased, but I think universities can be a sort of great helper with a lot of these. I don't know if Misha found that, because our whole, you've had some wonderful lines, Misha, about capture and how universities, do you remember any of them? I quote you in the report. It said something like, why should free speech only be for people with an agenda? Do you remember that?
That's right, yeah. Well, from our point of view, part of the reason that we work with academics is because what we're really talking about is public interest journalism, and public interest journalism in the ideal state, and it's never been this way through history, but it really relies on your main person that you're working for is the audience, right? They've got to be the absolute core. Now, the difficulty is when you're talking about philanthropic money, which we're talking about today, or being owned by a big mogul, you can have the same problem, which is there are other agendas, other considerations that are structuring your thought process and what you do. So one of my concerns with the philanthropic money side of things that we're talking about today is it's terrific, and almost always it goes to really valuable things, but it also is inherently distortionary. In Australia, We have a very affluent media mogul who famously, his name's Kerry Packer, he's dead now, but he famously had a kidney failure, and he was taken by helicopter to a hospital, and then he gave $5 million to the renal, part of that hospital, which was terrific, right? But do you really want to have a rich person have to have kidney failure every time you want to do a particular story? And going back to your question about philanthropic project funding as opposed to sort of core funding or activity funding, my view is that journalists at their best are entirely responsive to their audiences and to the public interest. And if they are tuned into that, ideally you're looking at a core funding, not a project funding model, because even if the things are worthy, it still distorts what you do. And for us, part of the advantage that we have is working with academics who, because in most parts of the world there is at least some public funding for universities, they are people who aren't pushing a particular interest. They are able to speak with that idea about what does the evidence say about what is best for society overall, and we think it's really valuable to have that in the discussion.
Sure. The one thing I'll also say about the core funding versus the programmatic funding is also that a lot of the times I feel the way programmatic funding themes are determined by funders is not necessarily reflective of what matters in different places. It's usually either a hype or a topic that feels like, that just simply feels like the right thing to fund, but it's not necessarily reflective of needs in different places. That's on the one hand. On the other, when we're talking about core funding, we're especially in, places that are facing democratic challenges and so on. We're talking about investing in building institutions and in actively responding to the institutional deficit that is happening in the civil society, in the shrinking civil society spaces. So it is important to think also in terms of sustainability in investing in institutions that are here to stay, that are resilient, that are kind to their journalists, that are supporting their growth, that are actually attracting other journalists, younger journalists, and training them. And that's core funding, really. That's not programmatic funding. So,
shall I take another question? Or Nick wanted to come in, please.
Just to be clear, there is a dramatic need for a step change in the amount of money going into quality investigative journalism. It's obviously this hand-to-mouth survival mode, particularly for organisations in the emerging economies and developing economies, is just like impossible and has to change. And there are lots of huge pools of huge amounts of money which have been discussed in recent times, whether it's an asset recovery fund or international aid organisations giving a small amount of money into a fund for investigative journalism, the Facebook, Google tax, fines that are on financial organisations, a small amount of money from those going into this sector is, I think, it has to happen quite soon.
Absolutely, yeah, we've been talking about that all morning. I think we have time for one more question before we have to give the room back. Okay, great, yes, please.
My name is Ahmed. I'm a podcaster from Egypt, and I've started 2 years ago, but right now I am, as they define, as a digital nomad. My previous experience was in startups, so from Egypt, it's quite scary now when you have so many oversight, for media administration. So my question, I have revenue streams, I have partnerships, and I outsourced everything. How long can I survive as a digital nomad? I hope someone can tell me forever. Thank you.
Well, historically speaking, in my book Global Muckraking, I would say that many of the global muckrakers, I'm thinking really from the 19th century onwards, lasted 5 to 10 years. But I don't know now what, and that changed, by the way, my whole idea about journalism. Because before that, I had thought, before I did this book, Global Muckraking, I thought we have to build strong institutions that last. And then, through studying all these historical examples, I saw that even though many of these outlets were short-lived, they actually had a tremendous amount of impact. And often what would happen is a person got passionate about an injustice, they started something, like E.D. Morel and his newsletter about, the Congo, and then they had an impact, and then they went off and did something else. So historically, I'd say 5 to 10 years, but maybe the others are more optimistic or have newer data.
Well, I would just say in our journey with Hibr, we say we started in 2007, even though I don't think that's accurate because there have been 2 distinct chapters in Hibr's journey. So in the first chapter, we were a volunteer-run citizen media. We called ourselves a citizen media platform. So basically, nobody was paid to produce content. We were starting to make some money from trainings or projects or small things like that, but obviously no money for content at all. And it just continued like that for 5 years. And then in 2012, we made that big transition into a professional online magazine with a team, editorial staff, an office, all of that. And sometimes I have fleeting moments where I think like, to go back to the days when it was volunteer run and like surviving on passion and just without all these like operational costs and expenses. But they're fleeting moments because I look at what we produced then and what we have been producing in the past few years, and it is a huge difference between the quality and the depth of the journalism, of the analysis, of the research. And this is work that in no way could have been produced in that previous setup. So I think I don't know, maybe that doesn't quite answer the question, but sometimes there's something nice and liberating about the idea of working with people who are just passionate and giving time on a volunteer basis and just wanting to do something alongside, like hustling alongside other jobs and doing it in the evening and all of that. But really, if it's going to have impact and if you're going to produce something sustainable and meaningful journalistically, I believe personally that it just has to make that leap. And I agree completely with what Lina said, that our role is not just in terms of producing the journalism, but also the institution building, building the institutions that are attracting these young journalists, who want to come and train and learn and do internships and have that kind of space. So, yeah.
So I think I'll end on a positive note by saying 2 things. One is the outlets that hire bookkeepers or have accountants do seem to do better. Mm-hmm. So it's worth investing in that if any of you are planning to start something. And then the other point made by Guy Berger and many others is that all of those journalists that you're training and all those people that start startups that fail go on very often to do other things. So when you mention Emmanuel Dagbevy, I feel like I met him at a training in Berlin 20 years ago. So all these people that I trained or ran workshops with, and you could say, oh, it was a 3-day workshop, it didn't do enough. They're all still around, and I run into them at places like this. So yeah, sure, there is some brain drain where people go off to the World Bank to do PR, they go to the local stock exchange, but a huge number of people kind of go off and seed and reinvent themselves. And Lina, you're a case of that. You started young as a startup, now you're training a lot of people. So people don't actually go away after they've put all this money and time into these projects. So I hope that even if it's just 5 to 10 years doing this, you'll probably go do something great later, right? Good. Thank you all for coming. This was a really interesting discussion. I'll leave the report here if anybody wants. You can also find it online if you don't like paper. And thanks to a wonderful panel. That was terrific.
Thank you.